We're on DAF Pei Amid Aleph, and we were learning yesterday about the law of being mizakeh someone in the ERU. And we explained that there are really two ways to create an incorporated food entity, a food co-op partnership, such that the ERU is considered to be one corporate entity. One is by everyone contributing a portion of food towards the ERU, and another way is very simply one guy who's the tzaddik of the mavoi. He says, you know what, I have a barrel of food, and I'll apportion different pieces of this food. Each person in the mavoi will become an owner. But the thing is that you can't just do that through making a declaration. Another person who's not associated with you halachically has to make a kinyan by picking up that food and saying, I'm zocha on behalf of the other members of the mavoi. That's what's required. And we learned yesterday that the barrel of food, or whatever food it is, has to be picked up at least a tefach off the ground in order for that to happen. So let's go weiter in this vein. Itmar, where it's about the 10th line in the Gemara and Daf Pei, Shitufei mavuos, that when you want to create an eruv or a shituf in your mavoi, Rav Omar ein tzarech lezakos, Shmuel Omar tzarech lezakos. So already we see now that halacha that we had taken as given from our Mishnah is the subject of a machlokis. Rav says you don't have to do an act of zikoi. You can just say, you know what? I'm making an eruv for all the members of the mavoi. I hereby declare that the food that's in this barrel is jointly owned by all of us, and it's not necessary to have someone else pick up the barrel on their behalf. Shmuel says, no, you have to be mizakeh. You have to create that kind of kinyan where someone else picks it up on behalf of everyone else. The question, of course, is how can Rav disagree with the Mishnah? Rashi answers by telling us, and this will become clear from the Gemara, that Rav Tana upolig, that Rav sometimes has the authority to argue with the Mishnah when he finds a compelling argument, because he's just on the cusp of the generation between the Amoraim and the Tanoim. And therefore, usually, whereas normally he has the status of an Amora, sometimes we find that he can even take issue with the Mishnah. Eruvei Tchumin. Now, when it comes to Eruvei Tchumin, which is where you want to extend your tchum, your boundary, to go an extra 2,000 amos, Rav Omar tzarech lezakos, Ushmuel Omar ein tzarech lezakos. Here you have just the opposite. Rav says that we're more machmir be'eruvei tchumin, that if you want to sit down an eruv for someone else to extend their 2,000 amos, you have to have someone else bikona the food for them. In other words, let's say they want you to bake an eruv for them. So you take your food, you have to go over to another person and say, here, pick up this food on behalf of Yankel, I want to make an eruv for him. And that's the only way that it'll work. You can't just take your food and put it down for Yankel. Someone has to pick it up for Yankel and be zocha for Yankel. And Shmuel says you don't have to. Now, Bishlam alu Shmuel hachatznan v'hachalotznan, elolarav my taima. So the Gemara says, I can understand Shmuel. Shmuel is consistent with our Mishnah when it comes to the laws of shituf, of a mavoi, and therefore he's saying, consistent with our Mishnah, that you have to be mezakeh. And since we don't have an explicit Mishnah that tells us what the law is by eruvei tchumin, Shmuel is certainly within his right to say that you don't need to do as an act of being mezakeh. But Rav is going directly against our Mishnah. So what right does he have to do that? So the Gemara says Tanoihi. The answer is that it's a machlokas Tanoim as to the law of eruvei tchumin. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Maisa b'kalaso shel Rabbi Oshia. Here we have a story that occurred in the period of the Tanoim. The daughter-in-law of Rabbi Oshia, Shaholcha lebeis hamerchatz, that on Friday she walked to a place outside of the tchum of her city to go to the bathhouse. V'chashchala b'ir v'lachamosa. And unfortunately, whatever happened, she couldn't get home in time for Shabbos, and so she ended up being outside the tchum of the city when Shabbos came in. But fortunately, her mother-in-law had made an eruv tchumin, anticipating that she wouldn't make it back, and this would supposedly enable her to come back in. However, uba ma'isa lifnei Rabbi Chia va'asar. But then, when the shaila was brought before Rabbi Chia, is it okay for the daughter-in-law to come back in the city? He said, no, she can't come back in, because the Eruv was not duly constituted. So Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael b'Rebbi Yossi bavloi kol kachat tamachmer be'eruvin. So Rabbi Yishmael b'Rebbi Yossi says to Rabbi Chia, he's also a Tana, he says, Babylonian one. Rabbi Chia came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. He said, why are you being so machmir by the laws of Eruvei Tchumen? Kach Omar Abba kol sheyesh lecha lahakel be'eruvin hakel. That my father, Rabbi Yossi, had said that any time, since the institution of Eruvin is only midrabanan anyway, anytime you can be lenient, you should be lenient. And so therefore there was no reason for you to be machmir and prohibit the daughter-in-law from coming back in just because you feel that the Eru Tchumen that her mother-in-law put down was not duly constituted. So v'iboyeluhu mishal chamosa irvala umishum delo zichsala o dilma mishala irvala umishum deshalo midaita. The question was raised, what was Rabbi Chia's objection to the way that the mother-in-law made the Eruv? Right? Was it because the mother-in-law took her own food, like she was cooking in her kitchen, she was making a potato kugel for Shabbos, and she took half of the kugel and she brought it over to a spot which would allow the daughter to extend her tchum, and the reason why Reb Chia rendered it invalid was because she did not do an act of being mizaka, which means she didn't ask a third party to pick it up on behalf of her daughter-in-law. Or was the problem mishum odilma mishala irvala? Or did she go to her daughter-in-law's house, take out a kugel from her freezer, and bring it over to the spot where she wanted to make an eruv? In which case, the reason why it didn't work according to Reb Chia was because she did not have the express consent of her daughter-in-law to create such an eruv. Because as we'll see momentarily, and as we discussed yesterday very briefly, when I take someone else's food to make an eruv for them, I have to have their consent. I can't just assume that they want to make an eruv. Sometimes we'll see that that law does not apply, but in a situation like this, for an eruv tchumen, it would stand to reason that you need their consent in order for to be able to use their food for an eruv. So Amar Lohen Hahumi Rabbanan Rabbi Yaakov Shmei Ledidimi Farshal Aminei de Rabbi Yochanan Mishal Chamos Eruv Mishum Delo Zichsala. So Rabbi Yaakov said that I heard from my Rabbi Yochanan that the Ma'aser Shahaya was that the mother-in-law took her own kugel and brought it over to the place to make an Eruv Tchumen. And the reason why Reb Chia said it wasn't good was because she wasn't mezakeh properly. And that was the reason why it didn't work. So now you see that Rav has the basis. He holds like Rabbi Chia, who says that we have to be machmir by Eruvei Tchumen. And once you're machmir by Eruvei Tchumen, now you understand why Rav is also mekel by shitufei mavuos. In other words, just like Shmuel is machmir by shitufei mavuos and is mekel by Eruvei Tchumen, Rav is the converse, and he's machmir like Reb Chia by Eruvei Tchumen, and he's mekel by shitufei mavuos. What about the Mishnah? The Mishnah says that you have to be mezakeh. As I explained, Rashi says Rav Tanahu Polig. Rav is a Tana, and he has the authority to disagree when he sees a compelling reason to.
In a case like this, though, wouldn't it seem that the daughter-in-law would be happy, even if she didn't know it was from her fridge, would be happy?
We should assume that she would be happy. However, at the same time, there could be an argument. In other words, we don't know what the final psak is going to be in that case, because that was not the Ma'aser Shahaya. The Ma'aser Shahaya was the mother-in-law took her own kugel. But you're right, you should be able to argue that. Whether or not that will be the case, we'll have to see. Armalei Rabbi Zera Rabbi Yaakov Bira de Bas Yaakov. Rabbi Zera now said to Rabbi Yaakov, who was the grandson of who was the grandson of Yaakov, meaning that his maternal grandfather was Rabbi Yaakov. Now, why is he known by his maternal grandfather? Because his father either was not Jewish or there was some other kind of psul in his father that he could not be known by his father's name. Kimat is Hasam, and he said to him, he was a great Talmud Chacham, this Rabbi Yaakov, and he says to Reb Zera, do me a favor, when you get to a certain place, Akif v'zil l'sul l'ditzur, I want you to go take the pathway, take a detour to go to Tzur, u'ba'i minei me Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, and ask Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi the following shaila. In other words, ask him, what was the case by the mother-in-law? Why did Reb Chia paskin that the Eruv Tchumen was no good? So ba minei mishel chamosa irva mishum delo zichsala o dilma mishala irva o mishum deshalo midaita. Ask him, was it because the mother-in-law used her own kugel and she wasn't mizaka properly, or was it because she used the daughter-in-law's kugel and it was without her consent? So Amar lei mishal chamos seir v'lo mishum de lo zichsla. And he too, Rabbi Yaakov also said it was because it was the mother-in-law's kugel, but she didn't do a proper act of being mizaka. Amar Rav Nachman Aktinon, and Rav Nachman now says, here's the final psak. Echad ERU ve'tchumin ve'echad shitufei mavus. The Bach takes away those next three words. Tzarech lizakos, both by eruv tchumin, and when you're making a shituf in a mavoi, in both cases you have to be mizaka properly, which means you have to get a third party to pick it up on behalf of the person who needs the eruv, or the persons. So by Rav Nachman, ERU ve'tavshilin tzarech lizakos o ein tzarech lizakos. But Rav Nachman said, even though it's clear to me the halacha that you have to do an act of being mizaka for the Eruv Tchumin and Eruv Chatzeros, my question still remains by the third kind of Eruv, which is an Eruv Tavshilin, which has got nothing to do with carrying on Shabbos or traveling on Shabbos, but rather has to do with the law that if you want to be able to prepare food on a Yontif that runs into Shabbos, you have to begin the cooking process from before Yontif, and we do that by setting aside an Eruv Tavshilin. So that's a famous halacha that most of us are familiar with, and the question is, what happens if you know that someone wants to be able to cook on Yontif for Shabbos, but they're not available to do it themselves, and you want to make an Eruv Tavshilin for them? Do you have to be mizaka or not? Which means, do you have to actually do the pro forma process of having someone else pick up the matzah and the egg for them? Or can you just say, here's my matzah and my egg, and I'm doing this for Yankel, right? So Amar Rav Yoseph, Umayti boile, lo shemile had Amar Rav Nachman bar Rav Ada or Mar Shmuel, eruve tavshilin sarach lizakos. So Rav Yosef says, what kind of question is that? Don't we know that Rav Nachman had quoted Shmuel as saying that the halacha is by Erev Tavshilin as well, you have to be mezakeh. So Amar le Abaya pshita de lo shamile. So Abaya says to Rav Yosef, his Rebbe, obviously Rav Nachman never heard that psak of Shmuel, because if he had heard that di shamile mighty boile. Because if he had heard the psak of Shmuel, then why would he even ask it as a question? Why would he have even a doubt? So Amar lei atarivit chum milo Amar Shmuel ein sarach lezako. So Rav Yosef says no. Maybe he did hear the psak of Shmuel, but he wasn't sure whether we paskin like Shmuel or not. I mean, here's an example where we know that we don't paskin like Shmuel, because remember, in the case of Erev Tchumen, Shmuel also says you don't need to be mezaka, and yet we paskin that you do have to be mezaka. So maybe just because Shmuel paskins by Eruv Tavshilin that you have to be mezaka, who says that we paskin like him? Maybe we don't paskin like him. Maybe that's the reason why Rav Nachman has this question. So Abaya said back to him, the Amar Ihu tzarach lezakos, and maybe that's Rav Nachman is saying. Maybe that's the issue, is that maybe we don't paskin. Maybe Rav Nachman is wondering whether we paskin like Shmuel by the case of Eruv Tavshilin or not. So Abaya says, no, that can't be, because Hachi Hashda Bishlam Ahasam Pligi Ravu Shmuel v'Kamash Malan Kechurmin Demar v'Chi Churmin Demar Valhacha Yiisa Dishamiyale Miika Deman Depalig. So Abaya says, no, Rebbe, it can't be that that's the case, that Rav Nachman was aware of the psak of Shmuel, but is just wondering whether we paskin like him or not. In the previous case, when it came to Eruv Tchumin, it's one thing to say that we don't paskin like Shmuel. Why? Because Rav argues with Shmuel, and therefore once we know that there's someone who argues with Shmuel who's more machmir, then it's within Rav Nachman's purview to say that we paskin l'chumra like Shmuel when it comes to Eruve Chatzeros, and we paskin l'chumra like Rav and not like Shmuel when it comes to Eruve Tchumin. But in the case of Erev Tavshilin, if he had heard the psak of Shmuel that you have to be mezakeh, there's no one who disagrees with Shmuel, so why would Rav Nachman even question whether we paskin like Shmuel or not? The only time he wouldn't paskin like Shmuel is if there's someone who disagrees with Shmuel, but there's no one who disagrees with Shmuel over here. So obviously the reason why Rav Nachman had this even as a question was because he had never heard the psak. But now that you and I know the psak, then there's not even a question. Of course, by Erev Tavshilin also you have to be mezakeh. Let's go on to a Maisa. Hahu Turzina dahava b'shivavuse de Rebbe Zera. Now Rashi says, what is a Turzina? Is a person who's the man of arms. He is in charge of the weaponry of a city. And this fellow was a non-Jew. And as we've learned before, that when a non-Jew lives in your neighborhood and you want to create an Eruv, you can't just have him contribute food or be mazakin food to him, but what do you have to do? What do you got to do? You got to rent his space. You have to rent rights of passage in his property. You got to give him money. So what happened is that Rabbi Zera Amar Lei Oger Lan Reshusach, and Rabbi Zera went over to him and said, "We'd like to pay you to have rights of passage so that we can carry in our mavoi." So Lo Oger Lahu. And he was a shtarker. You know, guys that were in charge of the weapons of the city probably were pretty tough guys. And he said, "No, I'm not going to do it." So Asu Lakami de Reb Zera Amru Lei Mahu Lameger Midvisu. So they came to Reb Zera after this guy refused, and they asked him, "Reb Zera, would it be permitted for us to go to the guy's wife and offer her money instead?" Now this is a big issue because and Amar Lahu Hachi Amar Reish Lakish Mishmei de Gavar Rabba Mona Rabbi Chanina Ishtel Shel Adam Me'areves Shelo Midaita. And he said, "Listen, I have a Kabbalah from Reish Lakish in the name of a great man who was Rabbi Chanina, and he said that when it comes to the laws of Eruvin, a woman can act on behalf of her husband and she can contribute the food instead of her husband, even though it's not her property. But when it comes to Eruvin, we're makel to let a woman do that." Now, by the way, you cannot extrapolate from this halacha to other cases. There's a big shaila in the poskim. Your wife has your checkbook. A mashulach comes to the door. Is she allowed to write a check to the mashulach without your consent? It's a big shaila in halacha. There's a shaila of geneva involved.
Especially if you're against it.
This is objecting. This is even bigger.
So here you're asking a question, but you saw that this starker guy was against it, right? So it's a very valid point. I would tell you, the only way that I think that this could work, the reason why it works over here, is because the non-Jew lost nothing. In other words, it was only midas sdom. He was only just being mean. If a person could articulate a reason why he doesn't want to enact this, to have his wife accept money on his behalf, where he's relinquishing really nothing of substance, so then I think you can make an argument that your wife can't act on your stead if you make a physical mecha, right? But over here, the guy wasn't losing anything, and that's why I think that there was rights to be mekel. But again, shalom midato, your wife handling finances, shalom midato, is a big shaila in the poskim. You cannot extrapolate from here to other cases. Hahu turzina dehava b'shivavuse de Rav Yehuda bar Oshia. Another case of a shtarker, the guy in charge of the weapons of the town. He was in Rav Yehuda bar Oshia's neighborhood. Amrilei oger lan reshusach. So the people of the Mavoi said to him, "We'd like to rent rights of passage from you." Lo oger lahu. And he said no. All right, so asu lakame de Rav Yehuda bar Oshia. They came to Rav Yehuda bar Oshia, who lived in Mavoi. Amrilei mahu lameger midvisu. And they said, would it be permitted to rent from his wife? Lo hava biyadi, and he didn't know the halacha. So asu lakami de Rav Masna lo hava biyadi. They went to Rav Masna, he also didn't know. Asu lakami de Rav Yehuda amar lu hachi amar Shmuel ishta shalada ma'arebe shalom midaito. And they went to Rav Yehuda, and he quoted Shmuel as saying that a wife is allowed to contribute an eruv without the consent of the husband. And here too, you don't need the consent of the husband. You can just go to the wife and be socher rishus from her. Meisve. So let's challenge this. Nashim she'irvu v'nishtatvu shalomi das balein ein eruvan erev ein shitufan shituf. The Brisa says not that way. The Brisa says that if a wife contributes the eruv on behalf in the chutzner or in the mavoi on behalf of her husband, her act is null and void. So how can you tell me that her act is valid? Lo kasha hada asar hada lo asar. The Gemara answers and says that there are two different scenarios. In a scenario where if I, the husband, do not contribute to the eruv, I will preclude all of the other inhabitants of the chutzner or the mavoi from carrying, so then the rabbis are lenient and allow the wife to act on the husband's stead. If, however, the scenario is such where if the man does not contribute his food, the other members of the mavoi will be allowed to carry, so then the wife is not authorized to act on behalf of the husband. So let's explain what the case would be. Let's say you have a mavoi, and the mavoi is bounded by chutzers on both sides. The western chutzner, let's say, frequents the mavoi constantly, and the eastern chutzner only infrequently frequents the mavoi. If there's no eruv that's made with the eastern chutzner, this does not preclude the people in the west who did incorporate in the mavoi from carrying, because the people in the east are not frequent travelers into the mavoi. So therefore, they're not considered to be regular occupants of the mavoi, and therefore the mavoi is still considered to be duly incorporated. And that's why, if the husband, let's say, lives in the eastern chutzner, the wife is not authorized to contribute into the mavoi on behalf of her husband, because maybe the husband says, you know what, I don't need the mavoi this Shabbos. And therefore, and he's not going to preclude the other people from being allowed to carry, and therefore she's not authorized. But we're talking about a case where if there's only one chutzner, let's say, that leads into the mavoi, and he's the only holdout, and he's not available because he's out of town, and she's the only one that we can go to for the food, then for sure she can act on behalf of her husband to allow everyone else to carry. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Hachanami mistavra. This seems to be very logical, because the imkain kasha du Shmuel adu Shmuel. Because otherwise, if you don't say this, you're going to have a contradiction in Shmuel's two statements. Amar Shmuel, echad mi b'nei mavoi sheragal lihishtatef in b'nei mavoi v'lo nishtatef b'nei hamavoi nichnasen l'soch beso v'notlen shitufim nimenu bal karcha. That Shmuel had said a very big chiddush. He said, if a guy is normally used to making an eruv with this particular mavoi, because this is his regular access way, he's constantly in here every Shabbos, and for whatever reason he decides that he's not going to contribute food for that particular Shabbos, we are allowed to forcibly enter into his home and forcibly take food out of his cupboards in order to force him to be part of the mavoi. And what the Gemara's medayik is ragil in she'eno ragil lo. But that's only true if he's a regular dweller of that mavoi. But if he's not a regular passer through of that mavoi, so then we can't forcibly take his food. And yet Shmuel would previously had said that a wife is allowed to take the food without her husband's knowledge, which the Gemara seems to compare to being done against his will. So you see, the only way to reconcile it is Shema Mina. You see from here that there is such a distinction. When a person is the regular occupant of a mavoi, so then you can take the food from his possession, even shalom midaito, even without his knowledge, which means either forcibly or through his wife. But when he's not a regular occupant of the mavoi, such that if he doesn't contribute, he's not going to preclude the other people from carrying, so then you can't take it without his knowledge. So let us say that the following statement of the Brisa supports Shmuel's halacha, that kofen oso lasos lechi v'kora lemavoi, that we can forcibly construct a lechi or a korah at the entranceway to a mavoi, even without the consent of all the members of the mavoi. So the Gemara says, do you see from here that you can go against the will of the occupants because they're all in this together? The Gemara now says, no, shiny hasam deleka mechitzos. Answers the Gemara, it's different over there. You can't bring a raya from there. Because really, I could argue that from here you see no proof that you can forcibly, without a person's consent, take his food and make him part of the eruv. Because over there, you're actually doing an act of construction. There's two different ways, or at least two different ways of learning this answer of the Gemara. Rashi says that here the issue is not permitting people to carry. The issue here is that by constructing a lechi or a korah at the entrance to the mavoi, you are adding a security measure to the entrance of the mavoi. In other words, it's not really a full gate, it's not an actual enclosure to the entrance of the mavoi, but by adding some kind of fixture to the entrance of the mavoi, you're sort of adding some level of security, you're adding some level of demarcation that this is private property, keep out. And that's therefore what the occupants of a mavoi have a right to do. They can say, we want a gated community, or we want a little bit of extra security, and it's got nothing to do with the permissibility to carry on Shabbos. Maybe that's what that Bryce is talking about.
Maybe if you make it left.
1 second. That's the way that Rashi learns. Tosfos argues. Tosfos says that no. Here, too, we're talking about carrying, but there's a fundamental difference between carrying from the house to the mavoi versus carrying articles that were in the mavoi the entire Shabbos. Meaning as follows. Without a lechi and a korah, not only, and we didn't make an eruv at all, and there's no lechi and korah at the entrance to the mavoi, not only am I not allowed to transfer items that were in my house outside into my chutzner or into the mavoi, but I'm not even allowed to move items from one corner of the mavoi to another. I can't take the tricycle in one end of the mavoi and move it to the other. But by putting up a lechi and a korah, even though I haven't made an eruv to incorporate the space with everyone, but by putting up a lechi and a korah, at least I'm allowed to move items from one corner of the mavoi to the other, because it's now considered to be an enclosed area. Whereas by the case before, you're being even more, you're creating a more of a permissibility to carry. What you're doing is that not only are you allowing people to move items within the mavoi, but you're allowing people to transfer items from their private homes out into the chutzner and into the mavoi. To that extent, we don't see from the brisa that we can forcibly do, that we can force people to incorporate. And that's the difference between the two according to Tosfos. Go ahead, Mark. Okay. Lashon acher, mitzad shiny. Another answer is that from the side is different. Those words do not make any sense. The Bach completely removes them. The Vilna Gaon says that if there's a girsa change of lashon acher beveistin shiny, which means that any institutionalized fixture, such as putting up a lechi and a korah, which is mandated by Beis Din, that every mavui should have a lechi and a korah, perhaps that's the reason why the brisa says is you can force the occupants. But when it comes to making a shita for an eruv in a chutzner to incorporate a chutzner or a mavui, that's not something that's court mandated by the Beis Din, and therefore maybe that's the reason why you can't coerce people to contribute to an eruv. So once again, you have no raya from this brisa. Itmar Rav Chia bar Ashi Omar Osin lechi ashera. So in a related issue having to do with lechi and korah, Rav Chia bar Ashi says that you can make a lechi out of an ashera tree. Now this is a very big chiddush, because an ashera, the wood from an ashera tree is osir bahana. You're not allowed to get any benefit from it. But because you're doing it for a mitzvah, a halachic institution, and not for personal benefit, therefore we say that you're allowed to use something that's even usher for hana, because mitzvahs lavli hanos nitnu.
So
right?
Is it like a church becoming a shul?
No, I don't think so. I don't think exactly. I don't think it's exactly. I mean, there may be related issues as far as how you convert a church to a shul, but for this purpose, because mitzvahs lavli hanos nitnu, you're using it for a mitzvah purpose, and therefore you're not getting personal benefit from it, even though the truth is you are getting personal benefit because you're allowed to carry with it now, but it's a mitzvah related issue, and therefore it's okay. Reb Shimon ben Lakish Omar Osin Korah Asher. Rish Lakish says you're allowed to make a Korah, which is the crossbeam, out of an Asherah tree also. So, Mando Omar Korah Kol Shekain Lechi. If you hold that you can make the crossbeam out of an Asherah tree, then surely you can make a Lechi out of the Asherah tree. However, Mando Omar Lechi, but if you hold that you can only make a lechi out of an asherah tree, you cannot make a korah out of an asherah tree. Why? Because a korah has to be at least 1 tefach wide. And we have this principle that is elaborated upon in Maseches Sukkah, that when you have something that is forbidden for hana'ah, such as avodah zarah items, not only are you not allowed to get personal benefit from it, but any halachic structure that requires a minimal measurement of dimensions cannot be used with something that's asr bahana, that is prohibited for benefit. Why? Because when something is prohibited from benefit, it is considered to be not in existence for me personally, and therefore it doesn't have the requisite amount. This is very relevant in the Gemara's discussion in Maseches Sukkah about using a lulav that is from an asherah tree. Can you use a lulav that's from an asherah tree? On the one hand, you should argue yes, because mitzvahs lavli hanus nitnu. I'm not getting any personal benefit from it. But on the other hand, the Gemara says you cannot, because a lulav has to have a requisite measurement, and anything that's asur mishum avodah zarah is considered to be non-existent from a halachic standpoint, because I can't get any benefit from it, and therefore, since a lulav has to have a certain requisite length, this doesn't have that requisite length, and therefore it's possible for use as well. So that's what we're arguing over here too. Let's go on to the next Mishnah, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. Nismai ta'ochel mosif u'mizaka ve'ein tzarach lahodia. Now here the Mishnah tells us that if the food of the eruv, you've set aside food to be used for Shabbos, and for whatever reason a mouse comes along and nibbles away at the food, such that you don't have the requisite amount of food necessary to make your eruv. Now, what is that requisite amount? We're going to see momentarily. So the halacha is mosif, what you need to do is add on to the food to supplement the requisite amount, umizaka, and with that additional amount you are mizaka, which means you do that act of being mizaka where you tell a third party, go be kona on behalf of the residents of the mavoi, ve'ein sarach lahodia. And furthermore, if you're not taking your own food, which is an issue of needing to be mezakeh, but rather you're taking the residents' food in order to supplement the amount, you don't have to inform them. Why? Because since they had already contributed food, we assume that it is nicha for them. We assume that it is desirable to them that we take the food from their cupboards to supplement the necessary amount. Nitosfu aleihem mosefu mezakeh v'tzarech lahodia. But that's only true when the residents had previously contributed. Let's say new people move into the neighborhood. When new people move into the neighborhood, I have to add to the food of the eruv. So in that case, if it's my own food, I can be mezakeh on their behalf. But if I'm using their food, since they've never contributed to the eruv previously, I cannot assume that they want to be partners in the eruv, and I can't therefore go into their cupboards and forcibly take their food without their knowledge. I therefore must ask them first if I want to use their food. Kama hu shi'uran. So now the Mishnah asks, what is the requisite amount of food that you need for an eruv? So bisman shein merubin mazon shtei seudos lekulam. When there's a large amount of people, and that we have to define what a large amount of people is. When there's a large amount of people, then all you need is 2 meals, enough for 2 meals for one person, and that covers everyone in the mavui. Bisman shehem mu'atin, but if you have a small number of people in the mavui, so then kirugogeres l'chol echad ve'echad. You need enough bread that each person in the mavui would have a small piece of bread the size of a dried fig. Amar Rabbi Yossi b'medvar mamurim b'tchilas erev avol b'shiari erev kolshu. So Rabbi Yossi comes along and disagrees, and he says, no. The only time that you need to supplement a requisite amount for an erev, you don't need to do that if you already duly constitute the erev with your requisite amount. He holds that if a mice would go ahead and consume a portion of the eruv, you don't have to supplement it further because you started off with the requisite amount. The only time that you need to have a certain requisite amount is if you're starting from scratch. But if you already made the eruv and mice nibbled away at it, then you don't have to supplement it. Lo amru la'arif bechatzeros ela kadei shelo l'shakeach esatinokos. And finally, it seems like he's saying an independent halacha that even though the halacha is that you have individual chatzers that all feed into a mavoi. Once you make a shituf in the mavoi, that obviates the necessity for each individual chatzer to create their own eruv because they're already one corporate entity. But the rabbis nevertheless required each individual chatzer to add on to that and make their own eruv. Why? So that the children of that chatzer will know and see the laws of eruv and will not forget it. The Gemara now asks, B'may askinan? What are we dealing with? In other words, when we say that you need to supplement the food that was eaten by the mice, what illustrate for us the case? Ilema b'min echad ma'iryan ismayit afilu kalanami. Then why are you, if you're telling me that you're supplementing the food with the same kind of food? In other words, let's say previously we had constituted our eruv of a barrel of dates. Mice came by and they ate half the barrel, and we're going to supplement it again with more dates. So if I'm replacing it with the same kind of food, then afilu kalanami. Then even if all of the dates disappear, not just if some of the dates are eaten, but even if all of the dates are eaten or destroyed, I don't have to get express permission from the residents of the mavoi to be able to take dates from their cupboards. Ela bishnei minim afilu nismai nami lo. And if you're taking a different kind of food, let's say we had used dates previously, and now we want to use figs. If that's what you're talking about in our Mishnah, then even if there was only a partial destruction of the previous food, you would never be allowed to take the food without their consent. Why? I'll prove it to you. The Tanya, Kala ha'ochel mimin echad, ein tzarech lahodia, mi beis minim tzarech lahodia. that if the food gets lost, and from here the mashmos of kala, at least in the Havamina, is regardless of whether the food was completely destroyed or whether it was only partially destroyed, then if you're going to replace it or supplement it with the same kind of food, then ein sarach lahodia, then you don't have to notify the neighbors. You can take it from their cupboards without their knowledge. But if it's basement, but if you're replacing it with a different kind of food, then says the Brisa, then you have to get their consent. So the Gemara's question is, Mimon Afshach, our Mishnah doesn't seem to conform to the laws of the Brisa. According to the Brisa, if you're going to replace it with the same kind of food, then even if the dates had already totally been destroyed, you don't have to get the consent of the people. So why does the Mishnah say only if it's partially destroyed do you not have to get consent? And if you're replacing it with a different kind of food, so then you should have to get consent. So the Mishnah doesn't conform to either statement of the Brisa. The Gemara answers, Ibayis ema mimin echad, the Ibayis ema mishnei minim. I can explain the Mishnah either way. I can explain the Mishnah as talking about replacing the loss with the same kind of food, or I could explain it as referring to replacing the loss with a different kind of food. Ibayis ema mimin echad, my nismait, nismatmate. That when, I could explain the Mishnah as saying that when there is loss of dates, then you can replace it without their consent, because the Mishnah is not just telling me when there's partial loss, but it means even when there's complete loss, because the word nisma'et doesn't just mean partially lost, it could also be translated as nismatmate, which means completely lost. And therefore it would conform to the law of the Mishnah, of the Brisa, that regardless of whether there's partial loss or complete loss of the original food item, as long as you're taking the same kind of food, you don't have to get their actual express approval. Or alternatively, I could explain the Mishnah as talking about replacing the lost food, the partially lost food, with a different kind of food. And why is that consistent with the Brisa? Because the Brisa only prohibits you from taking the food without their consent when you have to completely replace the original item that was lost. But if a portion of the original item is still in existence and you only have to supplement it somewhat, there the Brisa would agree that you don't have to get their consent, even if you're taking from a different kind of food item. Okay, let's go weiter. Nitosfu aleihem emosifu mazaka v'chulei. The next thing that the Mishnah had said, that if there are new residents that move into the mavoi, so then you have to supplement the amount of food that's part of this eruv. You can be mezakeh for them, but if you want to take their food, then you have to get their express approval. Amar Rav Shizvi, Amar Rav Chizda, Zos Omeres Chalukan Alav Chaber Aval Rabbi Yehuda. Clearly, our Mishnah is in disagreement with Rabbi Yehuda, and this tells me that the Chachamim disagreed with their colleague Rabbi Yehuda. Ditnan, as the Mishnah says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bamedvar Mamurim be'eruve tchumin, aval be'eruve chatzeros ma'arvin bein lodas ubein shelo lodas. Rabbi Yehuda had said that the only time that you have to get express approval in order to make an eruv is if you're making an eruv tchumin for someone. But if you're making an eruv chatzeros for someone, so then you can take their food even without their knowledge. So you see that our Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, because according to our Mishnah, you have to get the people's consent in order to take their food for the eruv. So the Gemara says, Pshita de Chalukin. So why are you overstating the obvious? It's clear that our Mishnah argues with Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Mahu detema hani mili b'chatzer shebein shnei mavus b'chatzer shel mavo yechad emalo kamash malan. Because I might have argued that really there is no machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are talking about two different cases. The reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds that you don't have to get the consent of the residents is because he's talking about a situation where there's only one chatzor that leads out into the mavoi. So if one guy doesn't contribute his food, he's going to prohibit everyone else from carrying on Shabbos into the mavoi. And therefore we can forcibly take his food even without his consent. The Chachamim over here in our Mishnah are talking about a case where there's two chatzers that feed into a mavoi, and perhaps we're talking about one of the chatzers is not a regular traveler into the mavoi. And maybe that's the kind of person where the Chachamim say that you cannot forcibly take his food, because even if he doesn't participate in the eruv, the rest of the people of the Mavah will be able to carry. Maybe that's what I would have argued had I not had this statement from Rav Shizvi in the name of Rav Chizda telling me that no, that they're both talking about a case where there's only one chatzir. And there the Chachamim say that even though there's only one chatzir, the guy has to consent in order for you to use his food. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you can take it forcibly, because if he doesn't contribute, then no one will be able to carry. Now, Kamahu Shi'uro v'chuli. Then finally, the Mishnah had asked, what is the requisite amount of it that you need for an Eruv? So the Mishnah had said that if you're dealing with a small number of people, then you need to have enough for each person to have the size of a dried fig. And if you have a large number of people, then all you need is 2 meals for one person, and that covers everyone in the mavui. Kamahu merubin. So when you say when there's a lot of people, what does a lot of people mean? How many people is that? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Shmona Esrei B'nei Adam. 18 people. 18 residents is a lot of people. And once you have 18, then all you need to do is have 2 meals, and that's sufficient. Shmona Esrei V'sulo, you mean only 18, and that's the only time that you can get away with just 2 meals? Ema Mishmona Esrei Ve'elachu. Of course, what we mean to say is 18 and above. Anytime you have 18 or more, then you only need 2 meals for all of the people of the Mavoi. Umayshna Shmona Esrei Denakat. So where do you get this number 18 from? Where does that number come from? Amar Rav Yitzchak Bereda Rav Yehuda Ledidi Mifarshali Minei da Abba, that my father explained it to me. He said, Kol she'ilo mechalko lamazon shtei sudas b'neihen ve'ein magas grogeres l'chol echad ve'echad hein merubin v'sagi b'mazon shtei sudos v'lo mu'atin ninhu. Right? The answer is as follows, that there are 18 grogeros, there are 18 fig-sized portions of bread in 2 meals. In other words, if you were to break down 2 meals into fig-sized pieces of bread, you would get 18 pieces. And therefore, the Chachamim stated as follows. When you have up to 18 people, or including 18, so then you'll have enough. When you constitute every person having a fig-sized piece of bread, then you have enough for everybody. Once you get more than that, the Chachamim didn't want to be machmer, and they say you never have to put in more food than enough for 2 meals, which is the size of 18 grogeros. Be'agavorche kamash malan, dishtei sudos havyan shmon esrei grogeros, and it's just as agavorcha, incidentally, the rabbis also told us, if you want to know how many grogeros are in 2 meals, the answer is 18. Because basically the institution was 18 grogeros and no more. The reason why they phrased it in this way is to let me know that if you want to know how much is in 2 meals for a regular person, the answer is 18 grogeros. We'll finish off with the Mishnah. It'll take us 60 seconds. B'chol ma'arvin u'mishtatvin chutz min hamayim min hamelech divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that you're allowed to make an eruv out of any food item except for water and salt, because these are non-nutritive food items. They don't provide any nutritional value. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Kikar hu eruv, afilu ma'afesa avu prusa ein ma'arvin ba. Kikar ke'isr hu shalei ma'arvin ba. Rabbi Yeshua disagrees. And we'll see Rabbi Yeshua's reasoning in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Rabbi Yeshua says that no, even if you have a half a loaf of bread that's the size of one of these huge wedding challahs, but you got to go. So I mean, if anyone has to go, but I'm almost done. You have a huge challah, right? And it's the size of a chasana challah, right? So, but if it's only half of a loaf, so then you can't use it. But if you have a tiny little loaf the size of a coin, so then you can use it as long as there's enough for everyone to have a grogeres, to have a fig size. You'll get a few of those little tiny loaves, and that's okay. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yeshua, you need to have fully complete units of food. You can't have a partial unit. I'm sorry, I went over time.